At the end of the day, we're talking about a nuclear power taking on a small strip of land where a very finite number of backwards militants with no sophisticated military force to speak of. And you look at that and you say, well, maybe some of these global leaders are right, that this is collective punishment. How can we see it any other way if we're going to be objective? Images don't lie, pictures tell 1,000 words.
He has a poor track record on fasting. He was once accused of using vulgar language, but he said the accusation was bullshit. He loves the smell of gasoline and burning oil around his motorcycles and never stops drinking Coke Zero. He hasn't learned how to walk away from a fight. He's been to hell and back more than once, bringing a few public companies along for the ride. Other clergy scoff at him. The SEC and Big Pharma try to, quote, silence him for good. But their efforts haven't had the intended effect. That's Father Emmanuel.
Growing up in Tirana, where the call to a dawn echoed from the spiraling minarets, was a powerful experience for her. Albanians were forced to convert to Islam under Ottoman rule. In 1967, under the Marxist-Leninist regime, Albania became the world's first atheist state and destroyed churches to eradicate Christianity, in a land where St. Paul once preached the gospel. Her grandfather fought as a guerrilla fighter, and her father commanded a tank brigade. When communism collapsed, there was an insurrection against the state, leading to anarchy. Albanian women are known for their resilience. It is said they are born from the barrel of a gun. As a teenager, her father was flown out of the country without notice on a military helicopter to save his life. From then on, she started sleeping with an AK-47 next to her bed. That's Presbytera Theodora.
The killing of 1,200 innocent Israelis on October 7th, 2023 was an act of terrorism, and it's hard to say that Hamas is not a terrorist group. But the absolute destruction of Gaza, really the destruction of an entire country, and the displacement of all of its citizens is basically unparalleled in the history of wars. There have been 15 wars between Israel and Palestine that have been waged, but in this case, more have died than all the previous wars combined. And it's difficult not to feel great sorrow and great compassion and great empathy for the fact that the overwhelming number of those victims are women and children. In fact, the numbers are so tremendous that it exceeds the total number of Hamas militants.
To Khalil Sayeh, who's a political analyst and a Palestinian Christian. He's joining us from Chicago in the U.S. Khalil, thank you so much for being with us on Al Jazeera. Your father, I understand, died in a Gaza church that was hit by the Israelis.
This idea that if Judaism were out of the way, if Israel were out of the way, that Christians would unequivocally be at risk, I'm not convinced. I think it's at least worth asking the inverse question, which is, if the Arabs and the Muslims were out of the way, would the Christians be next? And you might criticize me for that and say that's outrageous. Netanyahu has proclaimed publicly his support for religious freedom, and that's what he says, but it's not really what he does. And we can see it so clearly in his statements in 2019 when he says Israel is a state for the Jews and for the Jews only. And then we see this sort of precipitous decline in the Christian communities to the point where we can see within a generation they're going to disappear from the Holy Land.
And then there's sniper bullets. I had children that were shot twice.
Wait, you're saying that children in Gaza are being shot by snipers?
Definitively. I have 2 children that I have photographs of that were shot so perfectly in the chest I couldn't put my stethoscope over their heart more accurately, and directly on the side of the head in the same child. No toddler gets shot twice by mistake by the world's best sniper. And they're dead center shots.
The grim tally now stands at a heart-wrenching 39,000 dead, with 90,000 more souls bearing the scars of this brutal conflict. Fears loom ominously as the shadows of the unaccounted whisper of even more lives lost to the merciless chaos of war. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more.
that we will maintain and increase our hold of the House of Representatives with Speaker Johnson. That's what's going to happen in November. And my message to those diplomats was to, when you send your cables back to your capitals in Berlin and in Paris and throughout wherever it is, that you tell them that the United States and this administration is going to look to where we are, each of these countries, where they stand with Israel. And if you don't support Israel, the United States is not going to be supporting you, is not going to be working with you.
Now when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, "Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, dreadfully tormented." And Jesus said to him, "I will come and heal him."
The Roman centurion commanded 100 soldiers in a Roman legion, and he was a Gentile. But that was irrelevant to Christ because cultural and ethnic differences were void. That's why Christ was willing to go under his roof to heal his servant. But in the eyes of the Jews, that would have made him unclean.
The centurion answered and said, "Lord, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it."
The centurion recognizes that although he has authority over men, Christ has authority over all, including over disease, which is why he calls him Lord. The phrase of the centurion, "Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof," is frequently quoted in the liturgical texts of the Orthodox Church and shows a deep understanding of our unworthiness before Christ our Lord.
When Jesus heard it, he marveled, and said to those who followed, "Assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And I say to you that many will come from east and west, and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go your way, and as you have believed, so let it be done for you." And his servant was healed that same hour.
There's 2 times in the Holy Gospel where Jesus marveled. The first time was at the unbelief in his hometown of Nazareth, and the second time was with the centurion, that he understood Jesus could heal his servant by speaking the word. These guys are only slightly more advanced than the Bronze Age, but more importantly, Israel is not only a massive, sophisticated, and organized modern military, completely equipped and armed with the United States' most advanced technology, including F-35 fighters and its Iron Dome missile system, but it's actually a nuclear power. If, let's say, 130 or 140,000 casualties have already occurred in Gaza, all of its citizens have been displaced, the country's basically been leveled, which I think is unprecedented in the history of wars, modern wars. What exactly was the threat? I mean, Hamas couldn't possibly be 30,000 members today. Let's say it's 15,000 or probably fewer. We could speculate. I don't think that Israel could argue that they pose an existential threat. And if you look at what's going on, the Orthodox Jewish community in Israel, this outrageous religious bigotry where they frequently spit on Christians, including priests and nuns. They urinate on churches. They defile the churches and damage crosses. This is part of their culture. And of course, if anything of that sort took place in the United States, it would be an outrage. Undoubtedly, there would be criminal charges would be drawn up. But if you think that the Orthodox element in Israel is a fringe, equivalent to, say, Islamic extremists, it's not. It's the driving force of their political policy, and it's a driving force of their culture. And I think it's really important to recognize that Christian persecution in the Holy Land and in Israel really began with the crucifixion and the death of Christ. Because we see in the Holy Apostles, shortly after his death, that it says they hid in the upper rooms because they were, quote, afraid of the Jews. So I think it's at least legitimate to ask, where's really the threat? Is it from Islam, when we see this sort of culture really begun with the founder of the religion, Muhammad? And of course, please don't take this as a defense of Islam. I'm not defending Islam. I know what Islam is. But if we look at it from a historical perspective, if we look actually from the founding documents of this religion, it absolutely assured the protection of Christians. And from the very beginning of Jewish-Christian relationships, we see that it began with persecution. It was the Sanhedrin, ultimately, which crucified Christ. People will say it was the Roman rulers, it was the secular authorities. That's not accurate. Yes, they needed the Roman authorities to carry out this horrible punishment, this terrible, ugly, and ignominious killing. But at the end of the day, when the Jewish people had to choose between a murderer, Barabbas, and Christ, they chose Christ, though the Roman authorities could see no sin and no fault in him. So this has continued for 2,000 years. And if you look at what's going on in Gaza, aside from the compassion that we must have as humans and as Christians for the unimaginable suffering of innocent children, because if you're a parent or if you're a person with a heart, every one of these children must be looked at as your own child. Certainly, it's true also for the Israelis who've been displaced. A growing number of Israelis are being displaced because of the conflict, the emerging and growing conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. Anytime an Israeli child was harmed or killed, or a woman, an innocent woman, our hearts should cry. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a nuclear power taking on a small strip of land where a very finite number of backwards militants with no sophisticated military force to speak of. And you look at that and you say, well, maybe some of these global leaders are right, that this is collective punishment. How can we see it any other way if we're going to be objective? Images don't lie, pictures tell 1,000 words. And we've gotten to a point now where we cannot speak in Europe or in the United States about the persecution of Christians unless we group it with the persecution of other religions, as if we're a dirty word to say that Christians are persecuted. We can't speak of Christendom even in the United States without saying Judeo-Christian, as if there was this harmonious continuum. To be sure, Christians find their origins in Jewish tradition, in respect for the law. Jesus said himself, I did not come to replace the law, but to fulfill it. And we have to understand that. But as it stands now, if we look at the relationships between Jews and Christians going back 2,000 years, we have to marvel, as Jesus marveled at the Centurion actually, that we give so much support to the state of Israel. It is almost as if the United States is a proxy state, a proxy country, or manufacturing base, a military manufacturing base for Israel and its many, many unending wars. And that culture of unending wars, where it's just one war after another, after another, after another, has permeated the culture and the politics of the United States. And now here we are on the eve of our great next political election, where a new president will be elected. And there's already war monitoring in Washington, D.C. about the need to invade another country, Iran, as if invading Afghanistan was a success, or Iraq, or Libya. How many leaders have been killed? Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and all of these others. Not that these were good guys, but what was the point of the billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, and more importantly, the American lives, which were above price, that were lost for these wars? To what end? Look at what's happening again in Gaza. Israel has dropped 70,000 tons of bombs, American-made bombs, using American warplanes, Israeli pilots, on the Gaza Strip in 6 months, between October and April. That's more than all the bombs dropped during World War II, tonnage-wise, on Dresden, Hamburg, and London over many years. Think about the scale of the destruction. So if people come forward and say, that looks a lot like a genocide, who can fault them for thinking that? It's at least worth asking the question. If that's not a genocide, what is a genocide? If you destroy an entire country, you displace all of its people, and you indiscriminately kill women and children, what's a genocide? I don't know. If that's not a genocide, I don't know what a genocide is. And increasingly, our government in the United States looks like a proxy government for the Knesset, because the things that the Jewish leadership, the Israeli leadership, gets away with in American politics, which they seem to basically control. It's politics, it's government by proxy. We don't see the inverse in Israel. Can you imagine if we said and did the things in America about Israel that they do in Israel against the Christians? Every time that a fact is pointed out, it's immediately labeled anti-Semitic, as if it's a catch-all phrase for someone who's done something terribly wrong. But I would implore everyone to just look at the evidence. Should Christians be eliminated from the Middle East? Should they be eliminated from the Holy Lands? Should they be eliminated from Jerusalem? Should a Greek Orthodox church, which stood for 1,600 years, be bombed when it stood without being touched, mostly surrounded by Muslim communities who actually protected it? that when the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem says this is a war crime, are we to criticize him? Is he wrong? Is he crazy? Or is maybe the political leadership in Israel crazy? We have to ask these questions. They are legitimate questions to ask.
My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. A mother's heart is never her own. Bits of it are sown into the souls of her daughters and her sons.